The auction hammer fell with a hollow thud that echoed through the nearly empty community center. Daniel Chen stood motionless, a crumpled bidding paddle trembling in his weathered hands. For $12,000, barely enough to buy a used pickup truck, he had just purchased 80 acres of farmland and a house that everyone in Ashford County seemed terrified to touch. The auctioneer, a portly man named Vernon Mills, avoided Daniel's eyes as he processed the paperwork. Around them, the sparse crowd of locals whispered among themselves, their voices carrying that peculiar mix of pity and relief that comes when someone else volunteers to carry a burden no one wants. Daniel had been a widower for 14 months, though it felt like both yesterday and a lifetime ago. Cancer had taken Rebecca slowly, methodically stripping away the vibrant woman who had been his partner for 27 years until only a whisper of herself remained in that hospital bed. Their dairy farm in Vermont had been sold to pay the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover, leaving Daniel with just enough money to start over somewhere, anywhere, that didn't echo with her absence. At 52 years old, he found himself unmoored from everything that had defined him. Husband, father to grown children who had their own lives now, farmer of land his grandfather had worked. The auction listing for the Ashford property had caught his attention, not despite its troubled history, but perhaps because of it. A place haunted by its past felt appropriate for a man haunted by his own. The house stood at the end of a long gravel drive, barely visible from the main road. Daniel's truck kicked up dust clouds as he approached on that first afternoon, the sun already dipping toward the western horizon. The structure was a weathered two-story farmhouse, its white paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin. The wraparound porch sagged in places, and several windows were boarded over with plywood that had turned silver with age. But the bones seemed solid, the roof intact, and the stone foundation looked strong. It was more than he'd hoped for at that price. The real estate agent, a nervous young woman named Patricia Hayes, had met him at the property exactly once to hand over the keys. She'd spoken quickly, her words tumbling over each other as she explained the basics: well water that would need testing, septic system of unknown condition, electrical service that hadn't been updated since the 1970s. What she hadn't explained, despite Daniel's direct questions, was why the property had sat abandoned for nearly 7 years, or why the previous owner had walked away from it in the middle of the night, leaving behind furniture, clothing, and even family photographs on the walls. "Some houses just don't suit certain people," Patricia had said, backing toward her car with obvious relief. "I'm sure you'll find it perfectly fine for your needs, Mr. Chen." Then she was gone, her sedan disappearing down the drive in a cloud of dust and unspoken warnings. Daniel stood on the porch for a long moment before inserting the key into the lock. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that would have been comical in a movie, but felt unsettling in reality. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the musty scent of abandonment and something else, something faintly sweet like dried flowers or old potpourri. The living room contained a faded floral sofa, an ancient television with rabbit ear antennas, and built-in bookshelves lined with paperback novels whose spines had faded to illegibility. A thin layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by the tracks of small animals, mice or rats, that had made themselves at home in the vacancy. He moved through the ground floor methodically, taking inventory. The kitchen cabinets still held mismatched dishes and glasses. A calendar on the wall was frozen on April 2017, days crossed off until the 18th, where the markings simply stopped. In the dining room, a table was set for one, a single plate and fork positioned carefully on a faded placemat. Upstairs, he found 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with fixtures that belonged in a museum. The master bedroom contained a neatly made bed with a handmade quilt, reading glasses on the nightstand, and a bottle of prescription medication dated 6 months before the house was abandoned. Everything suggested someone had lived here, maintained routines, and then one day simply walked away from their entire life. As the sun set, Daniel carried in his few belongings from the truck: 2 duffel bags of clothing, a box of basic supplies, his sleeping bag, and a battery-powered lantern. The electricity had been disconnected, and he wasn't sure when he'd have the money to get it turned back on. He'd camped in worse conditions during his years farming. At least here he had a roof and walls. He made a cold dinner of bread and cheese at the kitchen counter, washing it down with water from the gallon jugs he'd brought. Through the window over the sink, he watched darkness claim the surrounding fields, the woods beyond becoming an impenetrable wall of black. Daniel had just unrolled his sleeping bag in the living room, deciding the sofa would be more comfortable than the possibly mouse-infested bed upstairs, when he heard it for the first time. A voice, so soft he almost missed it, beneath the settling sounds of the old house, whispering. His body went rigid, every sense suddenly alert. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pinpoint. He grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the room, illuminating only dust motes and abandoned furniture. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding too loud in the empty house. "Is someone there?" Silence answered him, profound and complete. Daniel stood frozen, listening intently. Nothing. Just the ordinary creaks and groans of an old house adjusting to temperature changes. He was exhausted, he told himself, grief-stricken and emotionally drained. His mind was playing tricks, filling the silence with phantoms. He settled into his sleeping bag, but sleep was slow to come. Every small sound made him tense, his heart accelerating before his rational mind could identify the source. Wind in the eaves, a branch against a window, the house settling on its foundation. He was finally drifting off when he heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, definitely a voice, speaking words he couldn't quite make out, but that carried the rhythmic cadence of prayer. Daniel sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was female, he thought, though it was hard to be certain. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, or perhaps from upstairs. He fumbled for his flashlight and stood, the sleeping bag falling away. "I know someone's here," he called out, trying to sound firm rather than frightened. "You need to leave now, or I'm calling the sheriff." The whispering stopped abruptly, cut off mid-word. In the ringing silence that followed, Daniel heard something else, the soft sound of footsteps overhead, moving slowly across the upstairs hallway. Someone was definitely in the house. He climbed the stairs slowly, flashlight held before him like a weapon. Each step announced his approach with a creak that seemed impossibly loud. The upstairs hallway stretched before him, dark and empty. He checked each bedroom methodically, his light revealing only furniture and shadows. No one, nothing. The bathroom was equally vacant. He was alone in the house, yet he had distinctly heard footsteps. Back downstairs, Daniel considered his options. He could leave, drive into town, and find a motel. But he'd spent nearly every dollar he had on this property and the supplies to start farming it. There was no money for motels, and returning would only be harder if he fled now. Besides, Rebecca would have laughed at him for being spooked by an old house. "It's just settling," she would have said, her eyes twinkling with affection at his unease. "Old houses talk. You just have to learn their language." Daniel returned to his sleeping bag but kept the flashlight close. When the whispering came again an hour later, he was ready for it. This time he didn't move, didn't call out. He simply listened, trying to make out the words. The voice was definitely female, soft and worn like vintage fabric. The cadence was unmistakable now, the rise and fall of prayer. Gradually, he began to distinguish phrases. "Watch over him in the darkness. Keep him from harm. Let him not be alone." The words washed over him, and despite his unease, Daniel felt something unexpected. Not fear, but a strange sort of comfort, as if someone was genuinely concerned for his well-being. The whispering continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then faded into silence. This time, there were no footsteps, no other sounds, just the return of the profound quiet that filled the abandoned house. Daniel lay awake for a long time after, staring at the ceiling, thinking about voices in the dark and prayers spoken by ghosts or intruders, or his own grief-addled mind. Whatever was happening in this house, whatever had driven away the previous owner, he would face it. He had nowhere else to go, and perhaps, he thought, as sleep finally claimed him, a haunted house was exactly where he belonged. Morning light transformed the house from something sinister into merely sad. Daniel woke stiff and unrested, his body protesting the night spent on the ancient sofa. In daylight he could see the full extent of the neglect. Water stains on the ceiling, warped floorboards near the windows, cobwebs thick in every corner. But he could also see potential. The hardwood floors beneath the grime were solid oak. The crown moulding, though dulled by dust, showed craftsmanship from an era when such things mattered. He made instant coffee with water heated on a camping stove and stood on the porch, surveying his new domain. The 80 acres stretched before him in various states of wild abandon. What had once been cultivated fields were now shoulder-high with weeds and volunteer saplings. A collapsed barn listed dangerously to one side. Its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. But there was also a chicken coop that looked salvageable, several outbuildings that might contain useful equipment, and a small orchard where apple trees still bore fruit despite years of neglect. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the road, according to the survey map. Daniel decided to introduce himself, both out of courtesy and curiosity. If anyone knew the history of his property, it would be the locals who'd watched it sit empty for 7 years. He drove his pickup down the winding county roads, past farms in various states of prosperity, until he reached the mailbox marked Whitmore. The farmhouse was immaculate, its white siding gleaming, flowers blooming in careful beds along the drive. An elderly man was working on a tractor in the open garage, his hands dark with grease. He looked up as Daniel approached, his expression shifting from neutral to something harder to read. "Help you?" the man asked, wiping his hands on a rag, but not moving toward Daniel. "I'm Daniel Chen. Just bought the old Brennan place down the road. Thought I'd introduce myself to the neighbors." The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did you now?" It wasn't a question. "I'm Robert Whitmore. Lived here 43 years. He studied Daniel with pale blue eyes that had seen too many seasons. "You're the one who bought that house at auction. Heard about it in town. Folks were surprised anyone bid at all." Daniel smiled, trying to lighten the atmosphere. "I got a good deal, I think. Place needs work, but I'm handy enough." Robert's expression didn't change. "You experience anything unusual yet?" The directness of the question caught Daniel off guard. "Unusual how?" "Don't play games, son. That house isn't right. 3 families tried living there in the past 20 years. None lasted more than a month. The Brennans, they were the last ones. Good people, church folk. They left in the middle of the night, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Mary Brennan, she ended up in the hospital. Nervous breakdown, the doctors said." Daniel felt a chill despite the warm morning. "What happened to them?" Robert turned back to his tractor, the conversation apparently over. "You want my advice? Sell that property and move on. Some places are meant to stay empty." "I don't believe in ghosts," Daniel said, hearing the defensive edge in his own voice. "Didn't say anything about ghosts," Robert replied without looking up. "But you spend a few nights there, you'll believe in something. Mark my words." Daniel returned to his truck, Robert's warning echoing in his mind. As he drove back, he noticed something he'd missed before. Every house he passed had a cross prominently displayed, either on the door or in the yard. Ashford County, it seemed, was deeply religious. Perhaps that explained the fear around his property. Old superstitions died hard in rural communities. He spent the afternoon cleaning, opening windows to air out the stale atmosphere, sweeping decades of dust and debris. In the kitchen, he found a drawer full of papers, utility bills addressed to Mary and Joseph Brennan, receipts from the local feed store, and a small, leather-bound notebook. Daniel opened it to find a journal, Mary Brennan's handwriting neat and precise. The entries were mundane at first, recording daily chores, weather conditions, visits from grandchildren. Then, about 3 weeks into their residency, the tone shifted. Joseph heard something in the night again. "Praying," he says, "though I heard nothing. He insists it's a woman's voice, asking God to protect him. He seems more comforted than frightened, which worries me more than if he were scared." This morning I found him standing in the upstairs hallway, just staring at the wall, tears running down his face. When I asked what was wrong, he said someone was showing him how to be at peace. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting less controlled. Joseph barely sleeps now. He spends his nights sitting up listening to the voice. He says she prays for him specifically, using his name, telling him he's forgiven for things I don't understand. When I ask him what things, he won't say. Yesterday I found him in the attic going through boxes that aren't ours, belongings left by previous owners. He was holding a woman's scarf and weeping. I'm frightened. This house is doing something to him, or something in this house is. The final entry was barely legible, the words scrawled across the page. We're leaving tonight. I don't care about the money we've invested. Joseph is standing in the fields talking to someone I cannot see, and when I try to bring him inside, he looks at me like he doesn't know who I am. Whatever is here, it wants him, and I won't let it have him. God forgive us for abandoning this place, but I think God would understand. Daniel closed the journal, his mouth dry. Joseph Brennan had heard the same voice, the same prayers, and it had done something to him, changed him in ways that terrified his wife enough to flee in the night. He should have felt fear, should have been loading his truck and following the Brennans' example, but instead he felt something else, curiosity, and perhaps a strange kinship with Joseph Brennan, a man who had lost something, who had been broken by life, and who had found in this house something that spoke directly to his wounds. As the sun set, and Daniel prepared another cold meal, he found himself almost anticipating the night, wondering if the voice would come again and what it might say to him. The whispering began around 10 p.m., earlier than the previous night. Daniel was sitting on the sofa, Mary Brennan's journal open in his lap, when he heard it drifting down from upstairs. He didn't move this time, didn't call out or investigate. He simply closed his eyes and listened. The voice was clearer tonight, as if it had grown stronger or more confident. Father, watch over Daniel in his sorrow. Comfort him in his loneliness. Let him know he is not abandoned. Forgive him for the anger he carries, for the questions he cannot answer. Help him find peace in this place. Help him find rest. Daniel's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. The voice had used his name. It knew his name. More than that, it knew his sorrow, his loneliness, the anger that had been his constant companion since Rebecca's death. Anger at God, at fate, at the cancer cells that had multiplied without mercy, at the insurance company that had denied coverage, at himself for not being able to save her. He stood and walked to the bottom of the stairs, looking up into the darkness. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. The whispering paused, and in the silence Daniel heard something new, a soft sound like breath catching, like someone surprised to be addressed directly. Then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't praying. It was speaking to him. "I'm sorry," it said, the words so faint he had to strain to hear them. "I don't mean to frighten you. I only want to help." "Help how?" Daniel asked, climbing the first few stairs. "Who are you? What are you?" But the voice had retreated into silence, and no matter how long he waited, it didn't speak again that night. Daniel returned to his sleeping bag, but sleep was impossible. His mind raced with questions and possibilities. Ghosts, hallucinations, residual energy, mental breakdown, all seemed equally implausible and equally possible. As he lay in the darkness, he thought about Rebecca, about the months of watching her fade, about the prayers he'd spoken that had gone unanswered, about the faith he'd lost somewhere between diagnosis and funeral, and he wondered if perhaps this voice, this presence, whatever it was, had found him not by accident, but by some design he couldn't yet understand. I know this story has probably given you chills, and honestly, I'm right there with you. Before we continue with what happens to Daniel, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt a presence you couldn't explain? Maybe heard something in an empty house that made the hair on your neck stand up? Drop a comment below and tell me about it, because these stories, Your stories, they matter. They remind us we're not alone in experiencing the unexplainable. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're diving even deeper into what's really happening in that farmhouse. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. The truth about the voice is something none of us saw coming. Daniel woke to rain hammering against the windows, the sky outside a uniform grey that promised the storm would last all day. He'd barely slept, drifting in and out of consciousness, while his mind churned through everything he'd learned. The voice knew his name, it knew his pain, and most unsettling of all, it claimed to want to help him. Over instant oatmeal and lukewarm coffee, he made a decision. If he was going to stay in this house and he had no realistic alternative, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. That meant research, which meant a trip into town and hopefully access to information about the property's history. Ashford was the kind of small town that existed in amber, preserved against the passage of time by sheer, stubborn refusal to change. Main Street consisted of perhaps 24 buildings, a general store, a diner, a post office, a library that looked like it had been built during the Depression, and a white steepled church that dominated the town square. Daniel parked in front of the library, a Carnegie building with stone steps worn smooth by a century of footsteps. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor polish. A woman in her 60s looked up from the circulation desk, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone professionally neutral, but her eyes curious. Daniel had the distinct impression that a stranger walking into the Ashford Library was an event worthy of note. "I'm looking for historical information about a property I just purchased," Daniel explained. "The old Brennan place, about 8 miles north of town." The woman's expression shifted subtly, neutrality giving way to something that might have been concern or perhaps pity. "You're the one who bought that house at auction. I'm Eleanor Pritchard, head librarian here for 32 years. The Brennan property has quite a history." She stood, gesturing for Daniel to follow her to a back room lined with filing cabinets and boxes. "We keep local property records, newspaper archives, that sort of thing. What specifically are you looking for?" "Anything unusual," Daniel said. "I know the Brennans left suddenly. I'm trying to understand why." Eleanor pulled out several boxes, blowing dust off their lids. The house was built in 1923 by a farmer named Theodore Walsh. He lived there alone for 15 years after his wife died in childbirth, both her and the baby. According to the Historical Society records, he became something of a recluse. Neighbors said they'd see him walking the fields at night, talking to himself. In 1938, he hanged himself in the barn. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "And after that, the property passed through several owners," Eleanor continued, pulling out yellowed newspaper clippings. "None stayed more than a year or two. In 1967, a family named Morrison bought it. They had 3 children. The father, David Morrison, had a mental breakdown 6 months after moving in, tried to burn down the house with his family inside, said he was purifying it. The family survived, he didn't. Shot himself before the police arrived." The clippings painted a grim picture, a property that seemed to attract tragedy like iron filings to a magnet. A widow who'd lived there in the 1980s became convinced her dead husband was still in the house, speaking to her at night. She died of an overdose, ruled accidental, but suspected by many to be suicide. The Brennan incident was just the latest in a long line of people who'd entered the house whole and left broken. "Why hasn't anyone torn it down?" Daniel asked. "If it's this dangerous, why let it stand?" Eleanor's expression was troubled. "The county tried back in 1995, sent a demolition crew, 3 separate occasions, equipment failures each time. The last attempt, one of the workers swore he heard a woman screaming from inside the house. They never went back. Eventually the county just gave up, let it sit empty, and hoped it would fall down on its own." Daniel spent the next 3 hours going through records, piecing together a pattern. The house didn't affect everyone the same way. Women seemed able to sense something was wrong and would leave quickly. But men, particularly men who were grieving or emotionally vulnerable, they were the ones who heard the voice. They were the ones who changed. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said as Daniel prepared to leave. She handed him a small book, its cover worn smooth. "This is a diary kept by Theodore Walsh's sister. She visited him a few months before he died. You might find it enlightening." Daniel thanked her and returned to his truck, the diary tucked under his arm. He sat in the parking lot as rain streaked the windows, reading Margaret Walsh's precise handwriting from nearly 90 years ago. Visited Theodore today and found him much altered. He claims his dear wife Catherine speaks to him at night, that her voice brings him comfort. He says she prays for him, asks God to ease his suffering and prepare him for the day they'll be reunited. I tried to tell him this was his grief playing tricks, but he grew agitated, insisting I didn't understand. "She knows what I did," he told me, though he wouldn't explain what he meant. When I pressed him, he only wept and said Catherine forgives him, even if he cannot forgive himself. I fear my brother is losing his mind to sorrow. The entry was dated 2 weeks before Theodore Walsh's suicide. Daniel closed the book, his hands trembling slightly. A pattern was emerging, clearer now. The voice didn't just speak to grieving men. It spoke to men carrying guilt, men burdened by secrets or failures or sins they couldn't forgive themselves for. It offered them comfort, forgiveness, and ultimately, it seemed to offer them an escape. Daniel started the truck and drove back to the house, his mind racing. What guilt was the voice sensing in him? What unforgiven sin did it think he carried? He'd been a faithful husband, a good father, an honest man. Rebecca's death wasn't his fault. The medical bills weren't his fault. The loss of the farm wasn't his fault. Yet even as he thought these things, he felt the familiar anger rising, and beneath it, something darker. The guilt he'd never spoken aloud, not even to Rebecca in her final days. The relief he'd felt when she finally died, the shameful gratitude that her suffering had ended, that his vigil was over, that he could finally stop watching the woman he loved disappear by degrees. The guilt of having been glad, even for a moment, that she was gone. Back at the house, Daniel stood in the living room as twilight gathered. "I know you can hear me," he said to the empty air. "I know you're here, whatever you are. I want to understand. Why do you pray for the men who live here? What do you want from us?" Silence answered him, profound and complete. He made dinner, showered with cold water from a jug, and settled into his sleeping bag as full darkness claimed the house. Hours passed. The voice didn't come. Daniel found himself disappointed, even anxious. He'd been anticipating it, even craving it in some way he didn't fully understand. Around midnight, exhausted and frustrated, he climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. If the voice came from upstairs, perhaps being closer would help. The bedroom was exactly as he'd first seen it. Neat bed, reading glasses on the nightstand, prescription bottle gathering dust. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, and as he did, something crinkled beneath the pillow. He reached under and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, but sealed. His name was written on the front in elegant cursive, "To whoever comes next." His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the same handwriting. "My name was Catherine Walsh. I died in this house on March 3rd, 1923, along with my daughter, who never drew breath. My husband Theodore blamed himself, though the doctor assured him nothing could have been done. I watched him suffer for 15 years, unable to reach him, unable to comfort him. This house holds me, I don't know why, but I learned that I could speak, that certain souls could hear me, so I prayed for them, hoping to ease their pain as I could not ease Theodore's. I never meant to harm anyone, I only wanted to help." Daniel read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding. A ghost. A woman who died in childbirth nearly a century ago, trapped somehow in the house where she'd lived, trying to comfort the broken men who came after. But according to the records, her comfort had driven men to madness and suicide. Why? What was different about him? "Catherine," he said softly into the darkness, "if you're here, if you can hear me, I need to understand. The men who heard you, they didn't find peace. They found death. Why?" The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, precipitously. Daniel's breath misted in the air. And then the voice came, not whispering from a distance but close, so close it might have been spoken directly into his ear. "Because they couldn't forgive themselves," Catherine said, her voice carrying infinite sadness. "I would show them mercy, but they would only see their sins more clearly. The peace I offered required them to let go of their guilt, and letting go meant accepting death. I never asked them to die, but one by one they chose it." Daniel sat frozen on the bed, every hair on his body standing at attention. The voice, Catherine's voice, continued. "You're different. You carry guilt, but it's not the crushing kind. You're angry, yes. You feel relief at your wife's death, yes, but beneath it all you know you're not responsible for her suffering. You know you did your best." The others, Theodore, David Morrison, Joseph Brennan, they carried secrets that destroyed them from within. Terrible things they'd done, unforgivable things. When I prayed for them, when I offered them God's mercy, they couldn't accept it. The light I showed them only made their darkness more unbearable. "What did they do?" Daniel whispered. "Theodore killed his wife," Catherine said simply. "Not with his hands, but with neglect. She died in childbirth because he refused to call the doctor, believing prayer would be sufficient. He was a religious man, you see. He believed God would provide. When we died, when he finally accepted that his faith had killed us, it broke him. I tried to tell him I forgave him, but he couldn't hear it. He could only hear his guilt." The room was so cold now that Daniel's teeth chattered. "And the others?" "David Morrison molested his daughter," Catherine said, her voice hardening. "For years. When I prayed for him, when I asked God to forgive him, he heard my prayers as condemnation. He tried to burn down the house to destroy the evidence of what he'd done, to silence the voice that knew his secret. Joseph Brennan had an affair that destroyed his first marriage, drove his first wife to suicide. He remarried, never told his new wife, carried that guilt for 40 years. When I prayed for him, he heard his first wife's voice instead of mine. He couldn't bear it." Daniel's mind reeled. "So you only attract the guilty? This house only affects men with terrible secrets?" "Not only the guilty," Catherine said, "but the guilty hear me loudest. Their pain resonates with mine. Theodore's failure to save me echoes in men who failed to save others. I don't seek them out. They're simply drawn here, the way wounded animals are drawn to hidden places to die." Daniel stood on shaking legs. "I'm not like them. I didn't kill Rebecca. I didn't hurt anyone." "I know," Catherine said, and her voice held warmth now, compassion. "That's why I have hope for you, Daniel. You're the first man in decades to hear me who isn't drowning in unforgivable sin. You're just sad, just tired, just human. And maybe, just maybe, I can actually help you the way I've always wanted to help." "Help me how?" Daniel asked. The temperature began to rise gradually, the oppressive cold lifting. "By teaching you to forgive yourself for being relieved when your suffering ended. By showing you that loving someone doesn't mean you have to destroy yourself in their memory. By helping you understand that moving forward isn't betrayal." Catherine's voice grew fainter as if she were moving away. "Stay, Daniel, let me pray for you, not to prepare you for death, but to prepare you for life. That's all I've ever really wanted, to help someone live." The presence withdrew, leaving Daniel alone in the bedroom, Catherine's letter still clutched in his trembling hand. He stood there for a long moment, processing everything he'd learned, everything that had been revealed. Then he carefully folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and returned to his sleeping bag downstairs. As he lay in the darkness, he found himself whispering his own prayer, the first genuine prayer he'd spoken since Rebecca's diagnosis. "God, if you're listening, if any of this makes sense to you, help me understand what I'm supposed to do here. Help me know if I should stay or run. And if Catherine Walsh is really trapped here, if she's really been trying to help for 100 years, then please, for the love of mercy, set her free." Morning brought clarity and sunlight in equal measure. Daniel woke with a strange sense of purpose, as if the conversation with Catherine had shifted something fundamental in him. He spent the day working on the house with renewed energy, replacing broken window panes, patching holes in the porch, clearing years of accumulated debris from the gutters. Physical labor had always been his meditation, and today it served another purpose. It kept his mind occupied while he processed the impossible truth he'd accepted. A ghost lived in his house. A woman who'd died nearly a century ago was trying to help him heal, and somehow, inexplicably, he believed it. Around noon, a dusty sedan pulled into the drive. Daniel climbed down from the ladder he'd been using to access the roof and watched as a woman in her 40s emerged, carrying a covered dish. She had the weathered look of someone who'd spent their life outdoors, her face kind but cautious. "I'm Susan Cartwright," she said, approaching with visible nervousness. "I live about 5 miles south of here. Heard you'd moved in. Thought I'd bring you some welcome food. Casserole, nothing fancy." Daniel accepted the dish with genuine gratitude. "That's very kind. Would you like to come in for coffee? I can heat some water on my camping stove." Susan glanced at the house, her expression conflicted. "I appreciate the offer, but I'll be honest with you, Mr. Chen. That house makes my skin crawl, as since I was a girl." "Call me Daniel," he said, setting the casserole on the porch railing. "And I understand. I've learned some of the history. It's not exactly a cheerful place." Susan studied him with something like concern. "You're still planning to stay after what happened to the Brennans, to all the others?" "I am," Daniel said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I think I understand what's happening here better than they did. I think I might be able to help." Susan's eyebrows rose. "Help? Help what?" Daniel hesitated, wondering how much to reveal. "Let me ask you something. You said the house has made your skin crawl since you were a girl. Did you ever experience anything specific, hear anything unusual?" Susan wrapped her arms around herself, despite the warm day. "Once. I was maybe 13, 14 years old. Some friends and I broke in on a dare. You know how kids are. We were upstairs trying to scare each other when I heard it, a woman's voice, soft but clear, saying, 'You should leave now, child. This isn't a place for the innocent.' I ran so fast I nearly broke my neck on those stairs, never went back." "But nothing else?" Daniel pressed. "She didn't try to hurt you, just warned you away." "I suppose," Susan admitted, "but hearing a disembodied voice in an abandoned house was enough for me. The others laughed it off, said I was imagining things, but I know what I heard." Daniel nodded slowly. "I've heard the voice too, every night since I moved in. She prays for me." Susan's face paled. "Dear God, you need to leave, Daniel. That's what happened to Joseph Brennan. He heard prayers, and within 3 weeks his wife was dragging him out of here in the middle of the night because he'd lost his mind. Joseph Brennan was carrying a terrible secret," Daniel said quietly. "The voice, Catherine, she didn't drive him mad. She just made him confront what he'd been running from. I think that's what she does. She holds up a mirror to guilt, and some people can't bear what they see." Susan shook her head. "You sound like you're defending her. Whatever's in that house." "Maybe I am," Daniel said, "or maybe I'm just tired of running from things that hurt. My wife died 14 months ago. Cancer. I lost everything taking care of her, and when she finally died, I felt relieved. That relief has been eating me alive ever since. If Catherine can help me forgive myself for being human, for being glad the suffering ended, then maybe this haunted house is exactly where I'm supposed to be." The silence stretched between them, heavy with things unspoken. Finally, Susan reached into her purse and pulled out a card. "This is my number. You call me if you need anything, day or night. And Daniel, if you start feeling like maybe dying wouldn't be so bad, if that voice starts making death sound like peace, you call me immediately. Promise me." Daniel took the card, touched by her concern. "I promise, but I don't think it'll come to that. I'm not like the others." Susan climbed back into her car, but before driving away, she rolled down the window. "One more thing. There's a woman in town, Martha Green. She's in her 90s now, but sharp as a tack. She knew Catherine Walsh, was just a child when Catherine died, but she remembers her. If you really want to understand what's in that house, you might want to talk to Martha. She lives at the Ashford Senior Center." Daniel spent the afternoon considering Susan's suggestion. Speaking with someone who had actually known Catherine, who could tell him about the woman before she became a ghost, felt important. As the sun began its descent, he drove back into town and found the senior centre, a modest brick building with a garden out front where several elderly residents sat enjoying the weather. Inside, a nurse directed him to Martha Green's room on the second floor. He knocked softly, and a surprisingly strong voice called, "Come in, come in." "I don't bite despite what the other residents say." Martha Green sat in a wheelchair by her window, a book open in her lap. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, even accounting for age-induced shrinkage, but her eyes were sharp and bright. "You're the one who bought the Walsh house," she said before Daniel could introduce himself. "Small town, word travels. Sit down, young man. You look like you have questions." Daniel sat in the offered chair, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "I'm Daniel Chen, and yes, I'd like to ask you about Catherine Walsh, if you're willing to talk about her." Martha's expression softened with memory. "I haven't thought about Catherine in decades, though I suppose that's not entirely true. I've thought about what she became, what that house did to her, but I haven't thought about the woman she was, not for a very long time." She closed her book and set it aside. "I was 6 years old when Catherine died. She was our neighbor, lived just across the field from my family's farm. I adored her. She had the kindest smile, used to bake cookies for all the children in the area. She'd been married to Theodore for 3 years, and they seemed happy enough, though Theodore was always intense about his religion, fire and brimstone type, if you know what I mean." "I found her letter," Daniel said, "hidden in the bedroom. She says Theodore let her die because he believed prayer would be enough, that he refused to call a doctor." Martha nodded grimly. "That's the truth of it, though it wasn't spoken of openly back then. Catherine went into labor on a Sunday. Theodore believed that working on the Sabbath was sinful, and that included fetching a doctor. He prayed over her for 18 hours while she bled and suffered. By the time he finally broke down and ran for help, it was too late. She and the baby were gone within an hour of the doctor's arrival." Daniel felt sick. "And the town just accepted that?" "Different times," Martha said with a shrug. "Theodore was destroyed by guilt, that much was clear. He became a hermit, and people felt sorry for him. No one wanted to speak ill of the grieving widower, but we children, we knew. We'd hear him in the fields at night, crying and begging for forgiveness. My father said Theodore was being eaten alive from the inside. Catherine says she's been trapped in the house since she died," Daniel explained, "that she tries to help the men who live there, but something goes wrong. They hear her prayers as judgment instead of comfort." Martha's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You've spoken with her? Actually had a conversation?" "Last night," Daniel confirmed. "She explained that the men who hear her are usually carrying terrible guilt. She tries to offer them forgiveness, but confronting their sins drives them to madness or suicide." Martha was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "That sounds like Catherine. She was genuinely good, you understand. Not just nice, but good down to her bones. The kind of person who believed everyone deserved mercy, everyone could be redeemed. If she's been trapped all these years, still trying to help people, still trying to ease suffering even after death, well, that's exactly who she was in life." "Do you believe in ghosts, Martha?" Daniel asked. The old woman smiled. "At 94, I believe in most things. The older you get, the less certain you become about what's possible and what's not. Do I believe Catherine Walsh's spirit is trapped in that house? I believe something is there. Whether it's really her, or some echo of her, or just the house itself absorbing all that grief and guilt and playing it back, I couldn't say. But I'll tell you this, if Catherine is there, if she's trying to help, then maybe you're the one who can finally receive that help. Maybe you're the one who's broken, but not shattered, guilty, but not damned. Maybe you can accept what she's offering without it destroying you." Daniel left the senior center as evening settled over Ashford, Martha's words echoing in his mind. Back at the house, he lit his lantern and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook he'd found in one of the drawers. He began to write, putting into words all the guilt he'd carried since Rebecca's death. The relief he'd felt, the moments when her suffering had felt like punishment for both of them, the times he'd wished she would just let go, just stop fighting, just die so the agony would end. The shame of having negotiated with God, offering anything if he would just end it one way or another. The terrible bargaining that grief forces on the living. He wrote until his hand cramped, until every dark thought had been dragged into the light of the page. When he finally set down the pen, full darkness had fallen outside. The house was silent around him, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not oppressive, but expectant, waiting. "Catherine," he said softly, "if you're listening, I need you to know something. I understand what you're trying to do. I understand that you want to help, and I'm ready to let you, but I need you to understand something too. I'm not ready to die. Whatever peace you're offering, it has to be peace in this life, not the next. Can you do that? Can you help me without leading me toward death?" The silence continued for several heartbeats. Then, gentle as a breath, he heard her voice. "I can try, Daniel. God knows I can try. But you have to trust me. You have to be willing to face everything you've written in that notebook and truly, completely forgive yourself. Not justify it, not explain it away, but forgive it. Can you do that?" Daniel looked down at the pages filled with his darkest thoughts, his deepest shames. Could he forgive himself for being human in the face of unbearable suffering? Could he accept that love doesn't require self-destruction, that surviving wasn't the same as abandoning? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to try." "Then we'll try together," Catherine said, her voice warm with something that might have been hope. "Rest now, Daniel. Tomorrow we begin the real work." That night, for the first time since moving into the house, Daniel slept deeply and dreamlessly, the notebook open on the table beside him like a confession offered to the darkness. And in that darkness, a presence kept watch, praying not for his death but for his healing, hoping that after a century of failure, she might finally help someone find peace in living. The work, as Catherine called it, began in earnest the following morning. Daniel woke to find the notebook he'd filled with confessions, open to a blank page, and written in elegant cursive that wasn't his own, were 3 words: "Begin with truth." He stared at the handwriting, his coffee growing cold in his mug. A ghost had written in his notebook. The impossible had become mundane, and somehow that felt like the most unsettling part of all. Over breakfast, he spoke aloud to the empty kitchen. "What truth are we beginning with, Catherine?" Her voice came softly, as if from the next room. "The truth that you loved your wife. Everything else, all the guilt and relief and complicated feelings, they all stem from that central fact. You loved Rebecca. You never stopped loving her, even when you were exhausted, even when you wished it would end. Start there." Daniel spent the morning working on the chicken coop, his hands busy while his mind wandered through memories. Rebecca laughing at his terrible jokes, Rebecca teaching their daughter to bake, Rebecca holding his hand during their son's college graduation. Rebecca, Rebecca, Rebecca. Every memory was tinged with the knowledge of what came after, but Catherine was right. The love had been real, was still real, existed independent of the suffering that followed. As he hammered warped boards back into place, he felt something loosening in his chest, some knot he'd been carrying unknotting itself by degrees. That afternoon, Robert Whitmore appeared at the property line, standing beside his idling truck. Daniel walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Whitmore," he acknowledged. The older man studied him with those pale blue eyes, searching for something. "You're still here. Been nearly 2 weeks now." "I am," Daniel confirmed. "And I plan to stay," Robert grunted. "The Brennans lasted 3 weeks. Morrison family, 6 months, but David Morrison was a stubborn fool. You seem different, though. More settled somehow." He paused, then added grudgingly, "I brought you something." He reached into his truck and pulled out a worn toolbox. "These were Theodore Walsh's tools. Found them in my barn years ago. Must have borrowed them before he died and never returned them. Seems right that they go back to the property." Daniel accepted the heavy toolbox, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you." "I can use these." Robert nodded, but didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against his truck, his expression troubled. "My grandfather knew Theodore, worked alongside him before Catherine died. He said Theodore was never the same after, said he'd see lights in that house at all hours, hear Theodore shouting at someone who wasn't there. Toward the end, Theodore told my grandfather that Catherine was trying to save him, but he couldn't be saved. Said he'd done the unforgivable." "He had," Daniel said quietly. "But Catherine forgave him anyway. He just couldn't accept it." Robert's eyebrows rose. "You talk like you know this for certain." "I do," Daniel said. "I've spoken with her, with Catherine. She's still in that house, still trying to help." The silence that followed was profound. Robert stared at him, his weathered face working through a series of emotions: disbelief, concern, fear, and finally, something like resignation. "You've lost your mind," he said, but there was no conviction in it. "Maybe," Daniel agreed, "or maybe I'm the first person in 100 years sane enough to accept help when it's offered. She's not trying to hurt anyone, Robert. She's trying to heal people. It's just that some wounds are too deep, some guilt too crushing. Those men couldn't bear to be forgiven." Robert shook his head slowly. "And you can?" "I'm learning to," Daniel said, "day by day." The older man climbed back into his truck, but before driving away he called out, "You need anything, actual physical help, not ghost help, you call me." Numbers on the toolbox lid. It was the closest thing to friendship Daniel had received from his neighbor, and it meant more than Robert probably realized. As days became weeks, a pattern emerged. Daniel would work on the farm during daylight hours, making slow but steady progress on repairs and clearing land. In the evenings, he would sit in the kitchen or on the porch, and Catherine would speak with him. Not always prayers, though those came too, whispered blessings over his sleep. More often they were conversations, the kind of deep discussions about life and death and meaning that people rarely have with the living. She told him about her life, growing up in Ashford, when it was just a crossroads and a general store, marrying Theodore with hope for a simple, good life, the joy of pregnancy and the terror of labor in an era when childbirth killed as often as it gave life. He told her about Rebecca, about building a dairy farm together, about raising children who'd grown up and moved away, about watching cancer strip away everything except the essential truth of their love. "Do you regret marrying Theodore?" Daniel asked one evening, nearly a month into his residency. "Knowing how it ended, would you choose differently?" Catherine's presence. He'd learned to sense it now. A warmth in the air, a gentle pressure that indicated she was near, seemed to contemplate the question. "No," she said finally. "Those 3 years were happy. He was a good man before guilt destroyed him. I don't regret loving him, only that his faith became a prison instead of a comfort. His God was all judgment and fear. Mine was mercy." "What happened to you after you died?" Daniel asked. "Why are you still here?" "I don't entirely know," Catherine admitted. "I remember the pain, remember feeling myself fading, and then suddenly I was standing in the bedroom watching Theodore weep over my body. I tried to speak to him, to tell him I was still there, that I forgave him, but he couldn't hear me. Days passed, weeks, months. He could sense me sometimes, I think, but he was too consumed by guilt to truly hear. After he died, I thought I might move on, but I'm still here, tied to this place by something I don't understand." "Maybe you're here because the work isn't finished," Daniel suggested. "You've been trying to help people, but no one's been able to receive that help until now." "Perhaps," Catherine said, and her voice held a note of longing. "If that's true, then what happens when the work is complete? When you're healed, when you've forgiven yourself and moved forward with your life, do I finally get to rest?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. If helping Daniel meant Catherine could finally find peace, move on to whatever came after, was he being selfish by wanting to stay, by accepting her help? And yet, what choice did either of them have? They were bound together by circumstance and need, a grieving widower and a century-old ghost, each trying to help the other find peace. The transformation in Daniel was gradual but undeniable. He smiled more easily. He slept through the night without nightmares. He began making plans for the farm, real plans that extended beyond mere survival. He bought chickens from a local farmer, repaired the coop, and soon had fresh eggs to sell in town. He cleared 3 acres and planted a late-season cover crop to restore the soil. He fixed the roof on the barn and organized Theodore's old tools, finding comfort in their solid weight and purpose. People in town began to nod to him on the street. Susan Cartwright stopped by regularly with food and conversation. Even Sheriff Porter, who'd initially been suspicious of the stranger who bought the cursed house, began to treat him like a regular member of the community. 2 months after moving in, Daniel received a visit from his daughter, Emily. She was 31, living in Boston with her husband and 2 children, and she'd been worried about her father's decision to buy a remote farm in the middle of nowhere. "Dad, this place is actually nice," she said, surprised as she walked through the now clean house. "I expected, I don't know, something creepy and falling apart. But you've made it a home." Daniel smiled, pulling a casserole from the oven. "It's getting there. Still a lot of work to do, but I like the challenge." Emily studied him with concern. "You seem different. Better, I think. Less angry than you were after Mum died." "I am better," Daniel confirmed. "This place, it's been good for me. Given me purpose again, helped me work through some things I needed to face." That night, after Emily had gone to bed in the guest room Daniel had prepared, he sat on the porch and spoke softly to Catherine. "My daughter's here. First time any of my family has visited since Rebecca died. They were worried about me, thought maybe I was giving up by moving out here." "Were you?" Catherine asked. "Maybe a little," Daniel admitted. "I didn't want to die, but I wasn't particularly invested in living either. Coming here changed that. You changed that." "You changed yourself," Catherine corrected gently. "I only provided a mirror and a safe space to look into it. The courage to face what you saw, that was all you." "Will Emily be safe here?" Daniel asked. "Will she hear you?" "Women rarely do," Catherine said, "unless they're carrying the kind of guilt that resonates. Your daughter is innocent, happy, whole. She'll sleep peacefully and leave none the wiser." Emily stayed for 3 days, helping with projects around the house and marveling at the change in her father. On her last evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she said, "I don't know what happened to you out here, Dad, but I'm grateful for it. You're more like yourself than you've been since Mom got sick. Actually, you're more at peace than I've ever seen you." "This house needed someone to care for it," Daniel said. "Turns out I needed something to care for. We saved each other, I think." After Emily left, Daniel felt Catherine's presence more strongly than usual. "You're ready," she said, her voice carrying certainty. "Ready for what?" "To let go completely. Not of Rebecca's memory, you'll always carry that, but the guilt, the anger, the relief, all the complicated feelings that have been weighing you down. You don't need them anymore. You've learned what they had to teach you. Now you can release them." That night, Daniel performed a small ritual. He took the notebook filled with his darkest confessions and carried it to the fire pit behind the house. As flames consumed the pages, he spoke aloud. "I forgive myself for being human. I forgive myself for being relieved when Rebecca's suffering ended. I forgive myself for not being able to save her, for not being able to fix what cancer broke. I loved her completely, cared for her faithfully, and when she died, I survived. That's not betrayal, that's life, and I choose to keep living fully and without guilt." The flames rose higher, carrying ash into the night sky. And in that moment, Daniel felt something break free inside him. Some weight he'd been carrying lifting away like smoke. He stood by the fire for a long time, tears running down his face. But they were clean tears now. Grief without the poison of guilt. He woke the next morning to silence, true silence. "Catherine," he called out, suddenly anxious. No response. He searched the house, calling her name, but the presence he'd grown accustomed to was simply gone. On the kitchen table he found a note in that elegant cursive. "Thank you, Daniel. You've given me what I've wanted for 100 years, the chance to truly help someone heal. I can feel the pull now, the call to whatever comes next. Don't grieve for me. I'm not lost, just finally free." Live well, love again when you're ready, and know that somewhere Catherine Walsh is at peace at last. Daniel sank into a chair, the note trembling in his hands. She was gone. The ghost who had saved him had finally found her own salvation. The house felt different now, just a house, old and in need of work, but no longer haunted. The weight of a century's worth of tragedy had lifted, leaving only potential behind. 3 months later, Daniel stood in front of Ashford Community Church, a place he hadn't entered since Rebecca's funeral. He'd been invited to speak at a Sunday service about his experience with grief and healing. Pastor Williams had heard about the transformation of the man who'd bought the cursed house and wanted him to share his story. Daniel stood at the lectern, looking out at the congregation, and began, 15 months ago, I lost my wife to cancer. 6 months ago, I bought a house that everyone told me was haunted, cursed, dangerous. They were right. It was haunted. By a woman named Catherine Walsh, who died in 1923, leaving behind unfinished business, a desperate need to help others heal from the kind of guilt that had destroyed her husband. What no one understood was that Catherine wasn't the danger. She was the cure, or at least she was the mirror that forced you to face yourself honestly. He spoke for 20 minutes, telling the truth about the voice in the darkness, about the prayers whispered over his sleep, about the conversations with a ghost that had taught him more about forgiveness than any living person could have. Some in the congregation shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward, captivated. When he finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Then Martha Green, sitting in her wheelchair in the front row, began to clap. Others joined her until the entire church was applauding, not just for Daniel's courage in sharing, but for Catherine's century of trying to help, for the grace that could flow even through tragedy, for the reminder that healing was always possible if you were brave enough to face yourself. After the service, people approached Daniel with their own stories of loss and guilt, of voices they'd heard and presences they'd felt. Ashford, it turned out, was full of people carrying burdens they'd never spoken aloud. One by one, they began to release them, encouraged by Daniel's example. The cursed house became something different in the town's consciousness. Not a place of tragedy, but a place of transformation, where a man had gone to die to himself and instead learned to live. Daniel continued to farm the land, slowly building something sustainable and beautiful. He dated cautiously, not ready yet, but no longer closed to the possibility. He had his children and grandchildren visit regularly, filling the house with laughter and life. He kept Catherine's letter in a frame on his bedroom wall, a reminder that help can come from unexpected sources, that healing often requires facing what we'd rather avoid, and that grace can flow even through the most unlikely channels. On quiet evenings, Daniel would sometimes sit on the porch and whisper his own prayers into the darkness, not to Catherine, but for her, thanking her for the gift she'd given him, the courage to forgive himself, the strength to keep living, the wisdom to know that surviving wasn't betraying. The house stood solid and welcoming, no longer abandoned, no longer cursed, just a home where a man had learned to be at peace with his past and open to his future. And somewhere, in whatever realm spirits inhabit after their work is done, Catherine Walsh rested at last, her century of vigil finally complete, her purpose fulfilled, her own guilt finally forgiven. The voice in the darkness had been silenced not by exorcism or abandonment, but by success, by finally finding someone who could receive the help she'd so desperately wanted to give. In the end, they had saved each other, a ghost and a widower, both trapped by grief, both freed by the courage to face truth and offer forgiveness. The farmhouse on the edge of Ashford would stand for generations more, but it would never again be haunted. Its ghosts had finally found peace. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that healing is possible even in the darkest places, then I have a favor to ask. Subscribe to this channel. Not just for more stories, though, I promise you'll get those, but because this community is becoming something special, a place where we can share our own ghosts, our own guilt, our own journeys toward forgiveness. In the comments below, tell me, What have you learned from this story? What burden are you ready to put down? And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone carrying guilt or grief that's eating them alive, share this with them. Sometimes the healing we need comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the voice in the darkness is trying to help, not harm. Thank you for being here, for listening, for being part of this community. Until next time, remember, you deserve peace, you deserve forgiveness, and you deserve to keep living fully no matter what ghosts you're carrying.